Good evening and welcome to ICAS Fall Symposium Lux 2021. I'm Shinja Kim, President and Chair of ICAS, and thank you for joining our program today. It's my pleasure to introduce our special guest speaker, Dr. Bruce Bennett, on the topics with a particular emphasis on countering weapons of mass destruction on the North Korea case. Dr. Bennett, ICAS Fellow, is an adjunct international and defense researcher at the RAND Corporation. He is an expert in Northeast Asian security issues, having visited the region for about 120 times and written much about Korean security. Bruce's research addresses the issues such as the North Korean military threats, negotiating North Korea nuclear dismantlement, future ROK military and force requirement, Korean unification, the Korean military balance, and potential Chinese military intervention in North Korea. He specializes in asymmetry threats such as weapons of mass destruction and how to counter those threats with new strategies, operational concepts, and technologies. And Bruce has facilitated a large number of seminar and war games to address those issues. He received a PhD in policy analysis from the Pardee Rand Graduate School and a Bachelor of Science degrees in economics from the California Institute of Technology. It is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Bruce Bennett, and hope you enjoy the program. And let's welcome Dr. Bennett. Thank you.
It's my pleasure to speak with you this evening. I was reminded of the time when I first came to RAND, and I interviewed and was expecting to wind up working on domestic research issues. And when I got done with my interviews, the director of the RAND graduate school program told me that I was going to be working on strategic nuclear warfare. So I am back to my beginnings in talking about nuclear weapons with regard to North Korea. I'm going to share some slides this evening, if this all works out, hopefully. Let's see, we're going to get a window, and we're going to get that. There. So hopefully you can see my first slide. Very good. I'm going to talk about understanding and countering the North Korean nuclear threat tonight. I should start, though, by saying we don't understand a whole lot about it. We don't know how many weapons they have. We don't know for sure what kinds and sizes and so forth. So we're dealing with a lot of darkness on their side, trying to make educated guesses. And that's what I'm going to try to do as we proceed tonight. And I'll look forward to your questions later. Let me start off by saying that if you want to understand interest in nuclear weapons, oftentimes it's important to understand the objectives of a country. And with North Korea, the objectives of the country are really the objectives of the Kim family. Number one objective, I think there's strong consensus in the community, is regime survival. The North Korean regime wants to survive, and they've made great deal to do about deterring attack by South Korea, by the United States, or by China. I'm told that in North Korea, a popular statement is that Japan is an enemy of 100 years and China of 1,000 years. But sometimes we forget that North Korea and China aren't close allies. In fact, North Korea often doesn't do what China asks them to do. There's a lot of antipathy there. The regime is also interested in demonstrating success to the North Koreans. Major purpose for their weapons of mass destruction program is it's one of the few areas where they've actually had some serious success. I've taken a lot of interest in a document that came out several years ago that was referred to as Kim Jong-il's will. There's some controversy about it, but I'll work from it a little bit tonight and say in it, Kim Jong-il told Kim Jong-un just before Kim Jong-il died that nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction are the only way to preserve peace on the Korean Peninsula. Well, preserving peace is what the regime needs to do to survive. And the other point he made was we must kick out the Americans from South Korea. This effort of decoupling the US-ROC alliance is an ongoing activity that I'll talk about later. Now you might say, well, okay, but why nuclear weapons for regime survival against external threats? This is really a return of history as well. Back in 1945, the US Joint Chiefs of Staff wrote this statement about the utility of atomic bombs. This was early on. They didn't have many. They were interested in deterring a large Soviet force from going into Western Europe. And they focused on destruction of the Soviet economy and of centers of population as the way of deterring the Soviet Union. I think there's a lot of analogy of that kind of philosophy to where North Korea is thinking today. Now, if we look at the North Korean nuclear weapon tests, and I've taken weapon yield estimates here from a particular journal article that does a good job of looking at the different physical effects. If these are roughly the estimates we should work from, and we then apply these weapons to targets in Seoul, in Manhattan, and in Beijing, these are roughly the levels of fatalities and serious injuries that would be suffered. A lot of people said that the October 2006 test was a fizzle. It didn't work very well. And yet, if it really was that size, we're talking about well over 100,000 casualties. From a warfare perspective, not much of a fizzle. But it's the other side of the estimates that concerns me the most. If indeed North Korea fields weapons like its sixth nuclear test at the bottom there, the amount of damage that they could do in Seoul, in New York, or in Beijing is substantial. And that certainly gives them an ability to impose deterrence on us when they can threaten that kind of damage. We need to be doing more thinking about how to deal with those kinds of threats. Now, North Korea doesn't just have a single nuclear weapon. What happens if they have 12 nuclear missiles or 24 nuclear missiles that they could deliver nuclear weapons against South Korea? Well, a lot of the impact of those will depend upon the ability of them to deliver those weapons to targets. And they could be stopped from delivery because of unreliability of their missiles, because of unreliability of the nuclear warheads, or because of some form of defense or offensive activity by the US and South Korea. So I've taken a number of different estimates of if we can get their delivery probability down to several levels there. Even if you get it down to 10%, that's not exactly reassuring of the type of damage they could do with even 12 nuclear missiles. And as I think we should argue, North Korea doesn't want to be down around a 10% delivery probability. They want to get to the higher end. So they've done a great job of trying to deny information to us on where their missiles are located, where their nuclear weapons are located, so we can't preemptively destroy them. They've said they would preempt a US and South Korean effort to destroy their nuclear forces. They fielded Iskander-like missiles, the KN-23, which potentially can maneuver in ways that would be difficult for our defenses to intercept. And if they really do field a hypersonic missile that they claim they have now tested, that would also be difficult to defend against. And of course, North Korea fields substantial special forces, that could well get involved in the suppression of our missile defenses. They're taking seriously being able to pose major threats against South Korea, and over time, their effort to field an ICBM with a nuclear weapon will at some point also pose a threat against the United States. Now, I started out talking about Kim family objectives of regime survival. We also see in official North Korean documents and in other items, North Korean interest in unification. Now, I think many people would argue, oh, North Korea can never conquer the South. That's just not even a possibility now. And I think pretty much it's not a particularly good possibility. Maybe more possible if they can break the US-ROC alliance, but it's not an easy thing to do. What does the guidance come out from Kim Jong-il in his will? He says we must unify Korea, but in order to do this, we must kick out the Americans from South Korea, and we must overcome Chinese political and economic interjections in our domestic affairs. In fact, he says, if we go to war, it could set us back several hundred years. And I'll talk about that in a minute. So what kind of unification could we be talking about? There are various types, but I think it's most likely that North Korea would be looking for some kind of way not only to exploit South Korean wealth, but to avoid South Korean contamination. We have to remember recently that Kim Jong-un spoke of rock culture and K-pop in particular as a vicious cancer that is corrupting North Korean youth, and if left unchecked, it would make North Korea crumble like a damp wall. Well, that takes you right back to the first objectives of seriously threatening regime survival. I don't think North Korea can conquer South Korea without getting that contamination. So what do I mean by that? I'm going to suggest that there are three possible ways one could think from a North Korean perspective about achieving unification. One would be to conquer South Korea. But as I said, that's probably too costly and subject to significant probability of failure. As I said, Kim Jong-il said, war will set us back several hundred years. And even if North Korea were to succeed, that would lead them to potentially control of the ROC, but an extensive diffusion of ROC culture into the North, as many North Koreans see what's going on in the South and bring that culture in. A second possibility, presumably, would be somehow to break the US-ROC alliance and then seize control of South Korea. That might work in terms of achieving unification, but it's not a very good prospect, again, in terms of the contamination from South Korea. So I think Kim is likely more interested in the third possibility I'm showing here, that is confederate, but keep this as a very loose confederation with serious division still preventing the contamination from the ROC going into North Korea from a North Korean perspective, and instead simply trying to exploit the South. North Korea telling South Korea, for example, look, all we really want is 50 trillion won a year. Just give us 50 trillion won and that's good. That'll let us build up our country and we'll have a great unification. Now, I talked about those two objectives. I think as we think about the unification, we have to think about it in terms of how would North Korea get to that third option? Well, already the South Korean polls that are run by the Korean Institute of National Unification show that about half of South Koreans believe that North Korea is militarily superior. If North Korea can break the US-ROC alliance, and North Korea appears to be militarily superior, certainly with nuclear weapons, That would be a serious concern. On the other hand, that doesn't mean that North Korea will give up thoughts of invasion of South Korea, even though they don't want to necessarily pursue that. That is how they establish military credibility for their deterrence and also keep their military prepared, do their military training, give them an intimidation capability, and give them an option if they have major stability problems. Third point I would make is I think North Korea is interested in establishing the regime as a regional great power. North Korea does not want US and Chinese influence, and they want to look like they're strong enough so that they can counter that. So where does that leave us? There are lots of estimates of how many nuclear weapons North Korea has. I've shown some here, there are others. I'm only going to say you don't need more than 20 or 30 nuclear weapons, as I was showing on the previous chart, to pose a pretty serious threat against South Korea. You'd need more to also threaten Japan, the US, potentially China, but North Korea is moving in that direction. In fact, we've recently learned that they appear to be expanding the uranium enrichment facility at Yongbyon, though we don't know whether that will be with P2 centrifuges or in an effort to try to work with a cascade of more advanced centrifuges, yet to be seen. Now, what do we want? Well, we want North Korean denuclearization. The problem is, I would argue Kim Jong-un has a really bad record of meeting his commitments. President Trump was fond of saying that North Korea's missile tests in the last 2 years of his administration didn't violate Kim's April 2018 commitment not to test long-range missiles. Problem was, when Chung Woo-young went to North Korea in March of 2018 and then came back to brief President Trump and get him to agree to a summit meeting. At that time, Kim agreed to suspend all missile and nuclear weapon tests, which he didn't do. A lot of people will say, well, the Panmunjom Declaration of April 2018 is really soft on denuclearization. I happen to differ in my interpretation, because I think the key provision is Article 1.1, which says North and South Korea will fully implement all existing inter-Korean agreements. If you look at the inter-Korean agreements that existed, you've got the 1991 Basic Agreement of Extensive Government and Society Personnel Exchanges that are reinforced in the Panmunjom Agreement, Articles 1.4 and 1.5. Kim Jong-un really never followed that part of the agreement. I would also argue the 1992 Denuclearization Declaration would be part of all previous agreements. And that says North Korea shall not test, manufacture, produce, receive, possess, store, deploy, or use nuclear weapons. Well, I think North Korea is in violation of a large percentage of those provisions. The Panmunjom Declaration also said that both North and South Korea agreed to hold dialogue and negotiations in various fields. And yet, that's not what Kim Jong-un's been doing over the last 2 years. He's refused to do that. Finally, we get to the 2019 New Year's address. In it, Kim Jong-un said he'd stop producing nuclear weapons and was doing no proliferation. I I think we have lots of evidence he's been producing nuclear weapons. The IAEA chief has just said that is the case. And I think there's reason to believe that North Korea has probably been involved at least in intellectual proliferation, if not something more. So what do I think the US ought to be doing? You'll remember at the end of April this year, President Biden announced that the study of North Korea had been completed, and he personally said that he was going to impose stern deterrence on North Korea, presumably to deal with nuclear attacks. Stern deterrence isn't achieved by vague threats. Stern deterrence is achieved when you are prepared to implement actions that an adversary doesn't want you to do. It's just the reality. We can go back to the Roman times, and the Roman general Vegetius said, if you want peace, prepare for war. Doesn't mean you're going to war, but you've got to be prepared to make a serious threat that an adversary realizes he doesn't want to cross into. So if North Korea is at some point going to use nuclear weapons, we've got a variety of things we can look at to stop that process in order to impose a stern deterrence. The items here is what he's got to do. Much of US focus has been on missile defense. We want to take out the missiles once they've been launched. That prevents us getting into some serious problems with possible preemption. We simply are responding. That's where we've tended to focus. But as North Korea's number of nuclear weapons has grown, generally speaking, that doesn't look like it's going to be enough. And so what we get led to is also thinking about what we can do to protect ourselves against nuclear effects. Simple example, South Korea has 12 airfields where they base fighter aircraft. That's where US aircraft would be based, brought into the theater as well, by and large. That's not a lot of targets for a country with 40 or 50 nuclear weapons, if not more. So we need to be looking at ways to prevent North Korea from effectively using the weapons. But more recently, the US has been talking a lot about operating left of launch. General Hyten, the former STRATCOM commander and current Deputy Joint Chiefs of Staff Chairman, talked about operating left of launch and said, for missile defeat, we should focus on how you defeat and defend left of launch first before it launches. Well, left of launch means you destroy the weapons before they can launch. That is preemption of a kind. It doesn't have to be total preemption. If North Korea launches one nuclear weapon, left of launch means we potentially have the ability to attack all of the rest without going completely out into preemption. So we need to be thinking about the possibilities there. The problem with any of these things is it's not a very credible deterrent unless we posture ourselves to carry these things out and train to carry these things out and are prepared to tell North Korea that these are the potential consequences of its behavior. Now, what do I mean? Well, I think North Korea knows that if they make a major nuclear attack on South Korea, they're going to face severe consequences. But what if they fire one nuclear weapon, an electromagnetic pulse shot out over the East Sea, and cause major electronic damage to South Korea? What of this process will we use to respond? Has the US said? Not that I'm aware of. We have said in our last nuclear posture review that if North Korea uses any nuclear weapons, we will respond in a way where the regime will not survive. If they fire an EMP shot, are we going to try to destroy the regime? And if we do, the national academies, the US national academies said in roughly 2005, if people are in a deep underground facility, you cannot destroy that with conventional weapons. It's got to be nuclear weapons. So apparently the nuclear posture review was suggesting that we're prepared to use nuclear weapons in response to any North Korean nuclear weapon use. It's an interesting prospect, which doesn't seem to be well developed in the US strategy. Let me then turn to how do we get to where we really want to go. No one wants to go to war. We want to deter war. We want to prevent it. But working with North Korea, I believe you've got to negotiate with carrots and sticks. You've got to be prepared to offer North Korean things that it wants, and it's demanding now lots of preconditions. It's ironic that as little as 4 years ago, North Korea was absolutely adamant that no preconditions could be had for negotiations. And yet now they're absolutely adamant that negotiations won't occur without preconditions set on the US, things the US has to do. So let's consider some of the things the US could do. Well, some of the carrots, we can offer humanitarian aid. That can be food aid. North Korea seems to need that now. It could be COVID vaccine, other vaccines, other medical care. We could go to education. My last trip to Korea was in December 2019, and I met with some ROK government officials. I was told that not long before that time, Kim Jong-un had gone to Kim Il-sung University and had given them two messages. Number one, all excellent students were going to have to go on and get their graduate degrees. And number two, North Korean professors were going to start publishing in foreign journals and publish widely in foreign journals. Well, what better way to make that happen than to invite some North Korean students in social sciences, business, economic, to come to US academic institutions and train them in those field areas and get them involved in publishing in US journals. So when they go back to North Korea, they can accomplish what Kim Jong-un wants. I'm skeptical that Kim Jong-un would allow that, but I think there's some logic to such a possibility. Finally, we probably have to do something about sanctions. As I look at the various kinds of sanctions that have been imposed on North Korea, I think the sanction that I would want to release control on first probably would be clothing production. It would affect many more North Korean elites, letting them know that we're concerned about them. We want to make sure they're doing okay. The money would not necessarily be going directly to the regime like it would with coal exports or things like that. So maybe that's where we do. And it doesn't solve North Korea's problems, but it's something we could offer, but probably not just for negotiations. We should be paying for something where we get something, some kind of termination of North Korean nuclear program, stop of production somewhere, something consistent with that. Now, that's carrots. What about sticks? I think the US has to start turning to psychological operations. Look, North Korea uses psychological operations every day, constantly affecting us. And they're always saying that the US hostile policy towards North Korea is the problem. We're so hostile. I have to ask, who's more hostile, Biden or Kim? After all, do Americans train our children that North Korea is our absolute enemy, responsible for all problems in the United States? That the United States or that North Korea is preparing to invade our country and destroy us, and that we have to have military power to counter that? That's hostility. And in my mind, that kind of hostility needs to be identified as much for the people in South Korea as in North Korea. We need to be making sure that our allies and the people in North Korea understand we're not the ones who are the only ones with hostility. If there's going to be a trade-off, let's see some trade-off in North Korean hostility. We also need to remember the North Korean human rights record. It's abysmal. It's been documented. North Korea denies it, but we need to be thinking about that because, quite truthfully, many of the North Korean elites can well be put into that human rights abuse pattern. Regularly, those people are sent off for retraining, executed, sent off to prison camps. Not everybody, a small fraction. But I have to admit, I've talked to many senior North Korean escapees, And when I talk with them, their family members and friends who have been purged, they're pretty upset about that. And I think that's a message that we should be prepared to deliver to North Korea. Finally, I would note that peace treaty is a great idea, but let's get real peace. The war of 1950 to 1953 is over. We don't need a peace treaty for that, but we do need a peace treaty for the Cold War that North Korea has waged against South Korea and the US since then. We need to have a peace treaty that says North Korean indoctrinations against the US, they're over. Because will we have ever real peace if North Korea keeps claiming that the US is its enemy and ready to invade North Korea? That doesn't sound like peace to me. I think we need to also make the point that North Korea doesn't need 100, 200 nuclear weapons. They only need a few. If that's all they have, prove it to us and we can stop there. And yes, I'm saying we may never get to zero. I think there's very little possibility we will ever get North Korea to zero nuclear weapons. But let's get them below thresholds which are really threatening. Okay, I will then stop at that and proceed with questions. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Bruce. Before we engage on next round, I just want to make sure that ICAS is not an agent of any government or foreign principles. And there's no foreign funds involved in our operation. Thank you. Now, Joe Bosco out there? If not, Sig Hecker? I know, Sig, you're out there. Sig, go ahead, it's yours.
So I am indeed.
Good.
So Bruce, nice to see you.
It's good to see you, Sig.
But frankly, I don't even know where to start. Let me say that, Rand Corporation has done such a fantastic job for the U.S. government for, over 60 years now. And of course, they've always sort of examined and are known for taking these looks at every angle of what could possibly happen in the U.S. Security arena. And I think, what you demonstrated here today is that, somebody needs to be looking at the worst case scenario of what can happen. And so that's the way that I look at your presentation, because I've been, I visited you at RAND. We've discussed North Korea, and the discussions were much broader, than what you presented today. And so the way I look at this, you sort of presented a worst case scenario. And I firmly believe that it's really important to sort of focus on what's the most likely scenario. And so let me just mention a few things, that occurred to me as I listened to you. When you talked about Kim's objectives, I think it's pretty difficult not to agree that the regime's survival is important. It's been that way for each of the Kims. I simply, on the basis of my visits and discussions with the North Koreans, I don't believe that they have any sense that unification by taking over South Korea, or even by the sort of infiltration that you mentioned, they've always sort of focused on the fact that they really are a weak country and trying to survive. So then a question, posed to that part of objectives, at least as I've studied it and I've talked to people who have a lot of experience, more than I do, in working with North Korea, that one of the potential objectives, going back to Kim Il-sung at the end of the Cold War, was that when he said that he was actually interested in reaching strategic accommodation with the United States. In other words, some sort of normalization in order to buffer, the influence, as you rightly put it, of China, but then also of Russia sort of casting them away. And at least, again, from what I know, Kim Jong-il several times, certainly the joint communique in 2000, and perhaps another time after that, would seem to indicate that strategic accommodation. And then I see it even at least, once or twice in Kim Jong-un's role. So the question would be, how come you ignore the potential that one of their objectives could actually be to reach strategic accommodation with the United States, and therefore offset Russia and China, and thus, actually improve the livelihood of their people and themselves. Sanju, I'll reserve other questions for later because I've already gone for a long time.
Good,
so if you give me
good.
a chance to come back
I'll
later.
give you another chance. Okay, Bruce.
Here. Thank you.
I have not seen evidence of that kind of move. Maybe Kim Jong-un is willing to do it, but when he refuses to negotiate whatsoever, suggests that he's not terribly anxious. Now, why would I do that if I were him? I would do that if I wanted to be more empowered before I then cut an agreement with the United States. How does he become more empowered? Well, it isn't going to occur economically. The economy doesn't seem to be doing very well, especially with the border of China closed. I think the way he becomes more powerful isn't with conventional forces. His conventional forces are atrophying. I think the one element of power that he has is nuclear weapons. That doesn't mean he intends to use them for destroying things, but I think he intends to use them as symbol of power and as a means of coercion. Now, I could be wrong. I'm not one of his advisors. I don't talk with him. But as I look at his operations, and again, as the IAEA chairman just recently said, he's still going flat out building nuclear weapons as best we can tell. If that's the case, he seems to be heading for trying to achieve a position of power where he can be declared a nuclear weapon state, where he can demand to be treated like a nuclear weapon state, and therefore have a level of equality. I mean, look at all of the statements that were made with the meeting with Trump about wanting to appear equal. He wants to appear to be a very powerful country. Now, why? Well, doesn't that turn back to regime survival? If Kim makes his country appear to be very powerful and to gain economic benefits, which is he claimed he would with nuclear weapons, then I'd say that feeds back to his interest in survival. So I'm not arguing that he's going to fire a nuclear weapon at anybody. I am arguing that we need to deter that, though, because he could lose control. He could have a bad day. One of a number of things could happen that we need to deter. But I am arguing that we need a more coherent approach to deterrence, and we need some actions taken to deter things like nuclear weapon buildup, nuclear weapon tests, ballistic missile tests, and so forth, that he doesn't seem to think that he has any responsibility to the international community. Look at the recent statements about duplicity of South Korea, that South Korea tested one thing, and what did he test? Exactly the same things. 800-kilometer ballistic missile, 1,500-kilometer cruise missile, exactly the same things the South's fielding. And at least the only representation I've seen of the hypersonic missile said it flew Mach 3. That's really supersonic. And oh, by the way, South Korea just announced it tested a supersonic anti-shipping missile. So he's been trying to make a case that he's being treated unfairly and he should be treated just like South Korea with no sanctions. And he's hoping to become empowered to achieve that. So that then would help him achieve regime survival. And I think he's struggling with that problem, but I'll cut it there.
Thank you, Bruce. Tong Kim?
Thank you, Sangju.
Okay.
It's very I enjoyed listening to Dr. Bennett for his very comprehensive and broad spectrum of the issues that he had discussed. And now I'd like to come back to a place where he discussed not the ICBM, but he talked about hypersonic and also KN-23 and type of missiles. These are ballistic missiles that can easily reach Japan, and of course South Korea is included. And he talked about the missile defense systems. I don't know where we are as far as the R&D of left of launch R&Ds or TMP, EMP prevention, preventive things, or North Korea's level of technology as far as the reentry breakthrough is concerned. And I think just focusing on what we know for sure that North Koreans are capable of today, as Kim Jong-un said in his eighth Party Congress statement, that he's going to pursue more tactical nuclear weapons systems, and I think he's doing that. He's been testing them. Now, what the specific missile defense measures against those moves, other than extended deterrent, which can be politically stated and so forth. And as Bruce mentioned, in fact, it is the continuous arms race between North and South. South Korea has been testing the same kind of stuff for themselves, but in the meantime, they're going to come up with some defense system better than what they have now, even with the PAC-3 and THAAD systems, and not covering those newest weapons that they seem to be developing and successfully testing. So I wanted to listen to Bruce Bennett about the missile defense system. Of course, Korea is talking about the KMC, Korean missile defense and so forth, but I don't think we have a complete set of defense systems against the new developments of the North Koreans threatening weapons.
Sure.
Thank you, Tong.
Yeah, so let's take a simple example. Scud missile fired from the southern part of North Korea, a little bit below Pyongyang, fired into South Korea, even to the southern part of South Korea, has about a 5-minute flight time. It's flying a little over Mach 1. You put a hypersonic missile that's at Mach 5 plus, and all of a sudden it's got a flight time of about 1 minute. 1 minute makes it very difficult to detect the launch, pass the launch off to a missile defense system, and then have the missile defense system intercept the incoming missile. In addition, if the hypersonic can maneuver, which is the objective of a hypersonic glide vehicle, a nice ballistic trajectory comes in and you know exactly where the warhead's going to be traveling. If it's a hypersonic which can maneuver, it's moving and you have a much more difficult time intercepting it. So yes, it's likely that current missile defenses are not up to the task of dealing with a real hypersonic. But think about it, an ICBM is also a hypersonic missile. We don't talk about that so much, but an ICBM flies 8,000 kilometers in 30 minutes. That's Mach 16 roughly. Or I'm sorry, Mach 13 roughly. That's hypersonic. So it goes very fast as well, and it's very difficult to intercept, even when it's on just a simple ballistic trajectory. We've got a lot of investments to make in missile defenses to improve the capabilities to deal with the systems North Korea has been fielding. Even if it's just the Iskander, its maneuverability, its ability to pop up and come down very rapidly at the end of its trajectory are problems. Now, going to Sig's point, hopefully we never have to deal with that. But to the extent that we do not have an ability to defend against it, then it leaves us open to some degree of North Korean coercion. And North Korea has gotten very good at coercing, at least with missile tests, not with actual attacks. But who knows if they become more desperate, where they will go. We just don't know. And as Sig says, some of this is worst case, but we still have to think it through.
Thank you. Donald, Kirk? Go ahead, Don.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm interested in your assessment of how well North Korea is doing in dealing with South Korea, bringing South Korea into dialogue and driving sort of a wedge, or at least exploiting potential differences between the U.S. and South Koreans, and how well the U.S. and South Korea might coordinate or stand up against this strategy. What do you make of this North Korean strategy, and of the will of South Korea to resist this strategy, and of the U.S. also to stand up against this strategy?
Well, this is difficult for President Moon. He's got a presidential election in a little less than 6 months, not for himself, but for his party, to make sure his party succeeds. One of the not too secret things about Korean politics is if the other party gets elected, you wind up in prison if you're the past president. And so I think that's probably an outcome he really doesn't want. I think he's also anxious. He pushed on peaceful coexistence from the very beginning of his time as president as his security policy with regard to North Korea. I think he'd very much love to have some kind of end of time where he gets some kind of summit with Kim Jong-un, he gets some kind of agreement for peaceful coexistence. That would be very positive for him. So Kim Jong-un has taken an ideal opportunity where there are lots of incentives for President Moon and his party to try to make progress on negotiations and to push the U.S. to compromise. Note that even the South Korean foreign minister was telling the U.S. what we need to do. I doubt that went over very well in Washington, but it just happened. So I think North Korea recognizes they've got some leverage. They're recognizing they have leverage on us because we do want to get back to negotiations, but we don't particularly want to compromise. But South Korea, our allies, telling us we got to compromise before the negotiations. We've got to meet preconditions. It's a difficult situation, I think, for both our allies, South Korea and the U.S.
Well, okay, brief follow-up. What are the prospects for an end of war agreement then, from all points of view? No, I'm not sure how enthusiastic the North Koreans are either about that, but what are the prospects?
I think that there's not the kind of support in Congress yet for that. There has not been the pushback from many potential communities. It's just barely starting to push back against the agreement that's on the docket in Congress now. Doesn't look like there's a lot of adequate support to get it through Congress. Could President Biden do an agreement just on his own? Possible. Hard to predict if he sees that as essential to getting some form of North Korean denuclearization. So I just don't know right now what the prospects are.
And thank you.
Thank you. Larry Nix.
Bruce, I want to ask,
Okay, Larry, go ahead.
can you hear me?
Yes, sure.
Okay.
I want to ask a little bit more about the Biden administration at this point. They talked about a review of policy earlier in the year. Review doesn't seem to have amounted to much from what we have seen so far. And my view is part of it has to do with what happened last year with Biden and his assistants as a campaign tactic against President Trump, denouncing Kim Jong-un as a means of denouncing during the campaign President Trump's what I call flattery diplomacy towards Kim Jong-un. And it seems to me one of the issues with the Biden administration now is that they got so stuck in this anti-personal diplomacy, or to use the Trump term, flattery diplomacy, that they can't break out with anything positive said about Kim Jong-un right now, even in a neutral way. And I think the Trump policy created within Kim Jong-un and his sister and their inner circle certain expectations, higher expectations now, about how the US and other governments and leaders should treat Kim Jong-un personally. And this is a hurdle now I think the Biden administration is going to have to get over if they have any chance of getting a negotiation going with the North. This really is about Biden and Kim Jong-un. That's part of the problem right now. The hostile statements between them last year grew pretty intense. And that's how the relationship was when Biden took the office in January, and it hasn't changed much since then. Whether Biden can break out of that in some way, I don't know. But I'd like to get your opinion on what you think he might need to do in terms of the personal relationship back and forth with Kim Jong-un.
Well, I think when we had our most recent discussion with Mark Lambert from the State Department, he mentioned that the U.S. was reluctant to negotiate with ourselves. Kim is saying he wants no hostility on the U.S., but isn't saying what it means. That's a trap for the U.S. in the sense that he's asking us to decide a bunch of things that we're prepared to put on the table before he'll even meet. So I think he's poisoning the situation now, as well as having had a problem last year. I think that at this stage, the U.S. has to start thinking, how do we do deterrence of things other than somebody shooting a nuclear weapon? And deterrence with North Korea can very heavily turn on information. Look, what's Kim Jong-un most scared about in the world now? I'd argue it's information. I think the U.S. needs to be prepared to take a carrot and stick policy to put out for Kim Jong-un. We're prepared to do these things for you, but if you're not prepared to proceed, these are the penalties we're prepared to impose. We'll start broadcasting K-pop into North Korea on a regular basis because that combination, I think, has got to be, so the administration can't look weak. I think you're exactly right there. They've got to look like they're strong, but that can be through a combination of carrot and sticks. And I think we need to also recognize one thing. You know, you go back to the Rock SLBM launch a couple weeks ago, North Korea showed a picture of that. And they showed it as a doctored picture, so it wouldn't look like it was actually a submarine launch. Why did they need to do that? I would argue they needed to do that because that picture, the picture from South Korea, had leaked into North Korea, probably at least to the North Korean military. And the North Korean regime had to try and say, no, that's false news. That's false information. Wasn't just a radio thing that people heard in North Korea about the launch. It was apparently also a picture. And that's a very interesting perspective of the kind of information that Kim may be susceptible to. I think we need to have a really serious psychological operations campaign that will work both for the US side, but also to convince North Korea that it really is time to come to the table. You can't just sit there and wait for us to offer everything you want, including US disengagement from South Korea, which appears to be at least one of the interpretations of no more US hostility.
Thank you. Bruce Klinger?
Yeah, hi, can you hear me now?
Good,
Hey,
good.
Yeah, I had to sign out first to hear people, and then I had to sign back out to have the microphone work. I kept hitting the unmute button. Anyway, to West Coast Bruce from East Coast Bruce.
Yes.
I came up with a question before you started talking, so you may have largely answered it, but that question was, despite repeated U.S. and South Korean attempts at initiating dialogue and negotiations, North Korea continues to improve its nuclear and missile capabilities. Do the missiles demonstrated in recent years and others paraded in 2020 and 2021 indicate any change in Pyongyang's overall nuclear strategy beyond its claims of only seeking to deter a U.S. attack?
Well, I think the parades are heavily for political purposes, as much internal as external. And, you know, we know with the Soviet parades, they paraded mock-ups. They didn't parade actual missiles. I think many of the missiles that North Korea's paraded are also mock-ups. I mean, you look at North Korea's behavior recently. South Korea has an 800-kilometer range ballistic missile. What do they test? They test an 800-kilometer ballistic missile. We're just as good as the South. 1,500-kilometer cruise missile. North tests a 1,500-kilometer cruise missile. But they couldn't match the SLBM launch. Now, I don't know whether that was a problem with the submarine, that it wasn't working, it was leaking or whatever, or whether it was a problem with the actual missile itself. Could be both, don't know. But they've been matching almost exactly South Korean capabilities recently. But what did they do on the submarine launch? They said, oh, it wasn't really fired from a submarine. It was kind of a fake. It's an early development. That's all political in my mind, or heavily political. So I think he's heavily pushing towards political. Now he reinforces it. He tests a missile which he claims is hypersonic. Now he's really pushing into capability and trying to make a point about the threat that's growing. So US, you better get in and negotiate with us, compromise so we'll talk with you. But again, that's almost as much political as anything. Are his capabilities growing? We certainly have some indications that that's the case. So yeah, I'm concerned.
Thank you.
Great, thanks.
Is Heather Kearney out there? Heather?
Hi. Yeah.
Okay,
Hi,
go ahead.
Sanju.
All right.
Hi, Bruce.
Hi,
Hey.
Heather.
Hi. How you doing? Quick question for you. So, with the end of war declaration that President Moon has recommended, who do you think would benefit from that more? I kind of go back to what you're saying about dividing the US and South Korea. So is it one of those things where we know President Moon was very adamant about achieving his agenda, and with the elections coming up next year, this would be a big win for him for all intents and purposes if he could pull this off? But then what would the North Koreans do to take advantage of that situation? Not that we wouldn't all like to see this happen, but I'm looking at it from the perspective of that starts a little bit of a divide between where the US is going vis-a-vis North Korea and what our objectives are, vice what the South Korean objectives are vis-a-vis North Korea. So in my opinion, I think it might be more of a win for the North, because you might start to see a little bit of a divide and then taking advantage of that gap. But what say you?
Well, we don't know exactly the North Korean strategy, but a number of people have commented that if you get that end of war agreement, whether it's a declaration or whether it's something more formal, the North is likely going to claim that therefore US forces no longer need to be in Korea. South Korea doesn't need as big a defense budget as what they've got now. So you start to break the alliance by the debate over the end of war agreement. You then try to put pressure on the alliance through saying, hey, US forces aren't needed in Korea anymore. They're just not needed there. And that puts some other pressures on the alliance. And then you field an ICBM if you're North Korea, and you tell the US, look, we can't guarantee we can get through your missile defenses, but we might be able to. And if we can, are you really prepared to keep giving a nuclear umbrella to South Korea if we could make Los Angeles or New York City or Washington, D.C. go away? So I think the North is working multiple angles, both current and downstream, to undercut the alliance. We're not seeing the activation of some of them quite yet, but we're seeing the direction which could facilitate those. And I think very clearly, what would be one of the biggest victories Kim Jong-un could get? It would be a break of the US-ROC alliance. Now, I think from Sig's point earlier, then Kim Jong-un might turn and say, now US, we want you to ally with us. But I think we'd be rather careful about that. But who knows what the actual objectives are there. Love to know what his strategy is.
Thank you. In-Hwan Oh.
Oh, hi, I'm here.
Go ahead.
Thank you for taking my question. I have one question and then 2 or 3 comments. One is, when do you think North Koreans, Kim's regime, feel severe burden for the fact that they have weapons of mass destruction or missiles? I think at some point they feel it's a serious burden. Better not to have it, to have better relations with the external world. I'd like to know when it can come, okay? The question, the comment that I have is that the North Koreans have about 3 weakest links that I know. One is Kim regime does not represent Democratic People's Republic of Korea. There's a clear difference between the two. So there's a weakest link. Another one is North Koreans recently stopping K-culture from South Korea. That's a very serious matter. North Koreans are Koreans, South Koreans are Koreans, same Koreans. K-culture going into North Korea, Kim cannot stop that. That's the intrinsic cultural issue there. So that's another weakest link. Another one is we democratic countries try to export to North Korea liberal democracy and a market economy. Market economy, we're halfway there because
North Koreans rely on 장마당 or flea markets, right? They rely on it. The rationing system failed. It's no longer there. So that's a big weakest link, and it's a halfway there for success. That's the 3 weakest links that I wanted to point out.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Okay.
so it seems to me that as we look at North Korea, we have to say, what is causing the greatest economic difficulty in North Korea right now? Is it the sanctions, or is it the border closure with China? I'd have to argue that they're probably pretty equal in terms of the burden being put on the North Korean people. But Kim Jong-un chose the border closure with China. Now, he said he was really scared of COVID and he had to stop the spread of COVID. How active is COVID in China? Now, China's claiming there are almost no cases in China. And from what we're hearing from people in China, if a case occurs, well, those people are shut away very rapidly, and it's not allowed to propagate much. So does Kim really fear a movement from China of COVID? Isn't it more likely that COVID will go from North Korea into China than from China into North Korea, given what we're hearing about what sounds like COVID in North Korea? So with all of those things in mind, I say, Kim's got to have another objective for closing the border. It wasn't just about COVID. And I think if you look at what's happened, he's used the closure of the border to shut down a lot of the people involved in the market system. I think you're exactly right. The market system was spreading into North Korea. It was starting to become a lot like South Korea decades ago. But Kim, I think, is trying to shut that down. If you can't bring goods and services across the Chinese border, then a lot of those people are apparently going bankrupt who are the traders. And if the people trading go bankrupt, well, that's good for Kim, because as long as they had money and they were wealthy, they could pay anybody they wanted to, bribe them, and get away from the directives of Kim Jong-un. Now they can't. So I think he's trying to undercut the system, the free market system in North Korea. I think that's a real problem right now. But I think he's the problem of sanctions as much as the outside. And if he's willing to accept that border closing to accomplish his objectives, what is it we would have to do with sanctions to get him to give up his nuclear weapons? I'm not sure there's a set of sanctions we could ever apply that China would allow to be applied on North Korea to that end, unless North Korea seriously offended China.
Thank you. Seung-jae Park?
Yes,
Go
I'm
ahead.
here. Yeah, well, actually, it's because of North Korea closed the country, but still North Korea having a test for the missile. So it might be possible, without the Chinese government supporting, North Korea may be very difficult to get the all spare part for the missile. So I'd like to hear your opinion.
We really don't know how independent the North Korean missile program is of outside parts, that sort of thing. Many people will claim that North Korea reverse engineered its missiles. They're building them all on their own. I had a fellow at RAND 10 years ago who looked at the alternatives there and said he was skeptical that they were doing it all on their own, that they were at least getting parts and maybe whole missiles that they were testing from the outside world. I mean, look at the US and the Soviet experiences over the decades. We didn't fire missiles the first time and have them work. It was often 5, 10 firings before they started really working well. And yet North Korea has, with the exception of the Musudan, an amazing success with its missiles. So we don't know, but it may well be that keeping the border closed is indeed impeding Kim's development of his threat. Don't know how much that is impacting the nuclear program. Does it mean he's unable to get the materials he needs to make centrifuges for uranium enrichment, to replace centrifuges that are broken? Maybe. Maybe it is impeding his program and slowing it down. But on the other hand, it really is the case where, Kim Jong-un seems to be trying to establish greater control at this stage. Don't know.
Well, thank you. Donald Kerr, go ahead.
Well, I just was following up on the latest remarks. I thought that North Korea had an ongoing terrific relationship with Iran. Now, I don't know how that's going now. I don't know how I thought that North Korea was sending stuff to Iran, technology and so forth, for their nascent nuclear program, and that Iran might be sending North Korea stuff too. And then, of course, there's Pakistan, where HQ Khan helped initially both Iran and North Korea. Maybe that relationship is still going as well. Might you expand on the Iranian and Pakistan connections with North Korea? Thank you.
Well, I'm afraid that I'm not the expert in that area. I think when we had our national intelligence officer for North Korea, he might have been able to answer that, but probably couldn't. Let me just say, from my perspective, I think North Korea operates as part of a cartel. It's an anti-US cartel, and we hardly ever think of it in that way. But I think you're right. I think a lot of things pass from North Korea to Iran to Pakistan. Now, not a huge amount of stuff, but it doesn't have to be a huge and diverse amount. Even a small amount could make a difference in North Korean capabilities. North Korea apparently provided no-dong missiles to both Pakistan and Iran. If that's the case, then Iran knows what parts need to be obtained for them. They can get those on the market and send them back to North Korea in exchange for maybe KN-23s. Don't know. But yeah, I believe there is a cartel out there. I believe it's operating. I don't know how much it's operating. In theory, China could impede it significantly if it stops flights between North Korea and Iran and searches the aircraft and takes off things that shouldn't be there. But I don't know that China's doing that. I haven't heard that they are. So anyway, just some perspectives there.
Thank you, Bruce. Is Sig Hacker out there? Sig Hacker?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Thank you. So thanks for letting me come back. So Bruce, there are two things, two additional things I would be interested in. And then one is, you mentioned near the end of your presentation that one of the things we should get North Korea to do is to decrease the number of nuclear weapons. You said they don't need so many. They don't need more than some threshold. And so I'm interested, how would you define that threshold? And are you just talking about numbers? Are you talking about type of nuclear weapons, the type of deliveries? So, that was an interesting proposal, but as I sit here trying to think through, I mean, not even minding the fact that how in the world you'd ever get the North Koreans, to go there. So then how would you define it? That's one. The second one, the other piece of your strategy is this psychological sort of information warfare. And yeah, there's no question. I mean, the North Koreans don't like that. I mean, we know that. But do you have any indication that that would actually be successful? What makes you think that that's a worthwhile endeavor that might bring us, as you say, I guess you would use that as a deterrent. In other words, instead of nukes, you'd sort of threaten them that you would do more damage through this psychological warfare. So those are my two quick questions. Thank you.
Yeah. On reducing the nukes, look, I don't think we're ever going to get to zero. I don't know what your perspective is, but I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think that reducing nukes is where we start. I think where we start is trying to stop production of new nukes. And so I'd like to see a nuclear production freeze in North Korea. Problem is, at least if I followed the Trump discussion with Kim Jong-un that Trump talked about after the Hanoi summit, he said that the problem that he perceived was that Kim offered Yongbyorn's uranium enrichment, and he knew about other facilities. And when he asked Kim to give up another one, Kim refused. So can we even get a nuclear production freeze? Partial freeze is, of course, better than none. But can we even get a freeze? That's a challenge. But I'd like to start there. Personally, that would be my preference. And turning to fewer nuclear weapons, look, we had all kinds of metrics we used during the Cold War to assess assured destruction. You know, what did we need? During McNamara's period as SecDef, he came up with 200 equivalent megatons. Well, I don't think North Korea needs anything close to that. And so we ought to have a study going on of what do we think North Korea would need for deterrence purposes, so that when we negotiate, we can say, as best we can tell, this is what you need. Now, that would include, as equivalent megatons did, both numbers and yields of weapons, reliability, probably other factors, and how we would pull all that together. That would be difficult, kind of like with the Soviets. When they came to negotiate to start with us, they refused to tell us how many weapons they had. And so we turned around and told them how many we thought they had, and that was what we were negotiating on. We may get stuck in something like that at some point. Now,
Thank you. Bruce, East Coast, Bruce Klinger.
All right, just fairly technical, but I've been struck by how many different systems North Korea has been developing in its missiles. They had 5 new systems in 2019, 3 new systems or basing systems just this past month, and we in the parade we had the Hugaksan 4 and 5 to go along with 3 and other and 1. Kind of what's the utility of having so many systems in development? Is it you just throw a lot of effort at different competing systems and then you pick the best one, or does having so many different weapon systems each play a niche role? It just seems sort of wasteful rather than picking a couple SRBMs, an IRBM, et cetera. So do you have any thoughts on why they're developing so many different systems?
Boy, I'd love to be sitting in the wall in Kim Jong-un's office to hear the answer to that one. But let me give you some possibilities. Remember that when North Korea fielded the Musudan missile, that their tests were a disaster. Failure after failure. It was very unusual for a North Korean program. I think that may well have caused North Korea to think that it needed multiple programs to hedge. I think they also concluded that multiple programs were going to put more pressure on the US, that we'd see many things, and even if they didn't test the missiles, as it's been the case with their SLBMs, that would still be some pressure on us. I don't know for sure. Certainly it would be pressure on the South Korean people. I can remember just during the 2017 period, when I talked even with South Korean military men, they were feeling severely concerned about the pressure North Korea was putting on the South Korean people at the time. that was really an uncomfortable period. So I think North Korea's experimented with how do they get their objectives. They don't have a lot of ways to do it. And maybe in some of these cases, building a dozen mock-ups, probably what they did with the initial ICBMs that they showed, maybe a way of causing US consternation earlier than they can with an actual test. And so they give it a try. Don't know for sure. They're obviously trying. I mean, I go back to my statement to SIG. I think Kim Jong-un is trying to get into a position of empowerment. He's trying to get to a place where he can argue that he can work with the US, not because he's a beggar, but because he's an equal. And he needs that for internal purposes, especially with his military. And I think that's a key part of where he's trying to go.
Larry, Nick, go ahead.
Thank you, Sangju. Can you all hear me?
All right.
Yes.
I want to go back to China with this question. In terms of what we have seen over the weekend and what may portend for the near future, the entrance of over 150 fighter bombers, bombers, anti-submarine aircraft by China into Taiwan's air identification zone. If China escalates this kind of military pressure and resorts into a full-scale military crisis that forces the United States to have to make a decision about military intervention to help defend Taiwan, if this kind of Chinese pressure builds up and we see it in more and more escalated military pressures against Taiwan, what would we need to watch closely in terms of any changes that this could bring about in the North Korean-Chinese relationship that would be detrimental to the US and to the US-South Korean alliance, which, if this happens, by the way, that alliance is going to be put under some real strain, which
Absolutely.
I don't think a lot of people understand, but that is going to happen.
Yeah, I think we have to remember that President No talked about not allowing any U.S. forces based in Korea to participate in such a conflict. So,
and the Pentagon would want to move our F-16s in a conflict with China out of South Korea to Okinawa and Guam, I think very quickly in any conflict with China that emerges over Taiwan.
yeah, if the conflict is limited to Taiwan, I think you're exactly right. The question is, does China see that if it tries to do that, allowing North Korea to attack the South would be a way of diverting the US, at least some of the US forces? I don't know. But it's a prospect that I think we have to contemplate in order to think about how we would respond to Taiwan. I think you're right. The US would want to marshal forces, and it takes a long time to send ground forces to Taiwan. We don't have infrastructure there. We're not prepared with that. Where we have infrastructure is in Okinawa for air forces, naval forces we can send up to the area. But that's where we would be focused, and China is well prepared to do an area denial kind of activity against our operations there. That would be an ugly conflict. Hopefully it never happens. But I have to admit, as I hear where US semiconductors come from, I'm really not anxious to have China take control of Taiwan. So I think there are a variety of issues there that say there are strong US interests other than just defending democracy in terms of the Taiwan defense. But it would be a very messy situation. And I think China, my sense is China will continue to escalate those provocations.
Thank you. Tom, go ahead, please.
Yes, thank you. I want to go back to unification and psychological warfare, especially during beginning with the Obama administration and throughout its 2 terms, there was a lot of talk about North Korean collapsibility. I remember you came to Korea when I was teaching in Korea University, and you gave a special talk on the topic and what to do, how to prepare for that, and even you concluded then the collapse is not a matter of time. It's not a matter of direction, but it's a matter of time. And everybody was started, and Lee Myung-bak government in that time kept telling Obama administration and its officials that the North Korea will collapse very soon, and therefore there is no need to negotiate with the North Koreans to discuss the nuclear issue. Obama timed out, and the North Korean regime survived. My question is, of course, collapsibility is one of the possible unification methods, unification by absorption, by South Korea absorbing North Korea when it collapses. That's one of the theories. Now, my question is, what's your view of the collapsibility of North Korea today, 10 years later?
Yeah. I think there are a lot of pressures in North Korea that are instability pressures. But as there were in East Germany in the late 1980s, I'm not really aware of anybody who accurately predicted what was going to happen to Germany. This kind of collapse would be an extremely complex situation. And I think we have to step back and we have to say, are we ready for collapse? Are we ready, for example, to co-opt North Korean elites? Because if we're not, are we ready to fight all of the North Koreans who could fight us? They have a relatively large military, and the South Korean ground forces are in the process of plummeting below 400,000 as an army. How would we manage that kind of thing? So I think we need to be increasingly thinking about, we can't predict when unification will occur, or even if it will, and how it will. But the possibility of collapse is real, I think. I mean, look at what the Eighth Party Congress did. Eighth Party Congress set up a number 2 in command of North Korea. That's pretty revolutionary. They're concerned about things, and with Kim Jong-un losing so much weight, maybe he's sick, we don't know. So I think we need to be better prepared. What are we offering the North Korean elites to make them think we will treat them any differently than we treated the Iraqi elites? Because the example with Iraq, the example with Libya suggests that the elites are in deep trouble. And if I were they, I'd probably fight a collapse that led to Iraq unification, maybe support a Chinese co-option of major parts of North Korea. I don't think we want that. And I think we need to be thinking about how we can convince them that there really is a future after unification under South Korea.
Thank you. Okay, Tom.
Yes, I was also going to mention the efficacy of information program, psychological warfare type toward the North Korean audiences, either by leaflet operations or loudspeakers or infiltration of information somehow into North Korean society. Do you think could it be conducive to the corrosion of North Korean stability, I mean, regime stability to perhaps a degree where North Koreans would worry about their own collapse?
I think Kim Jong-un has already said he's worried about that with K-pop coming in. President Moon was a big supporter of the basic agreement made in 1991 that would involve lots of exchanges between North and South Korea. He packaged a major part of that into the Panmunjom Agreement because I think he recognized that you've got to get the people together in order to prepare for a unification and make it smooth. I would certainly support more of that kind of thing as well. I don't think we necessarily have to target Kim Jong-un and say, we're going to tell your people about your mistresses and your eating and all of that kind of thing. But I do think we need to target his people and tell them about free agency, about market economics, about trade, about lifestyle. I mean, look at the popularity of South Korean soap operas in North Korea. The people love to see them because they suggest a lifestyle they can never dream of. And I think that kind of thing helps them realize that there really is life after unification with South Korea as a free democratic country. But the elites I'm worried about because we need to have a concept for what's going to happen to those people. Do we take away all their money? Do we throw them in prison? If that's what we're going to do, they're not going to be very positive about it.
Thank you. Donald? Don Kerr, go ahead.
A lot has been said.
Go ahead.
A lot has been said. A lot more could be said, but I think I pretty well, asked my questions. Thank you very much for your presentation and for your responses.
Thanks, Don.
Okay, Julian Avils, go ahead. Julian.
Hi, can you hear me?
Okay, go ahead.
Great. Hi. So you mentioned the carrot and sticks approach, and you've covered basically the sticks with psychological warfare and whatnot. But the carrots, humanitarian aid, free education, stuff like that. The Biden administration, to my understanding, is working on a new nuclear posture review. And it's been described as a step-by-step relief for particular steps, stuff like that, and democracy in a practical way. Given the track record that you outlined for Kim's commitments, how credible would that approach be, or how promising would that approach be?
Thank you.
The answer is probably not too effective. I think where we ought to start is we ought to say, look, he's already agreed to denuclearization. It's done. So now we need to get the specifics implemented. What kind of inspections are going to be done? What kind of information disclosures? I think those are the kinds of things we should be working on. He's not going to want to hear any of that. So I think we have a very difficult uphill battle to get to any kind of discussion. I mean, my understanding is in all of the negotiations which have occurred, it's not clear that North Korean technical experts have ever been present. Well, if you don't have their technical experts to talk with our technical experts, how do you ever really get a meaningful agreement on any possibility of denuclearization? So it really requires a different approach. And I don't think with carrots alone we're going to get there. I'm not sure we'll get there with sticks, but it's something we haven't really tried, and I think we probably need to.
Thank you. Inwan, go ahead.
Question to Bruce that as you know, South Korea is going through election for the next president. It's less than 6 months away. And also South Koreans are very concerned about leftist government for the past 5 years. And they worry that they continue during next administration. How much do you know, and what is your concern?
Well, there I have to be careful and avoid the political realm. I think there are people concerned on both sides about what the policies of Korea are going to be in the future. I think at this stage, it's important for us to allow the Korean people to have a free and democratic election. Hopefully it's an honest election, there's no cheating, and that the majority, or at least the plurality, elects the new president. I'm going to be very interested in seeing who the new president is and what his policies are. It's not clear to me that even if a progressive president is elected, that he will follow the same track as President Moon. Maybe. And I don't know for sure if one of the conservatives are elected, what track he will follow. So it's really hard for me at this stage to get into the political realm and project what the future looks like.
Thank you. Heather, are you still there? Well.
Yeah, thank
Yeah.
you.
Okay,
Sorry.
Heather,
I'm still here. Hey, I just had one quick follow-up question. What would be the game changer? What would North Korea have to do to really get everybody's attention? Because obviously you have outlined a whole host of things. Most of us on here have been living in North Korea for many years, understand. But what to you would be the one thing that would find everybody to really pay attention?
Golly, it could be a whole bunch of things, but let me give you a series of examples very quickly. ICBM test, that would get a whole lot of people interested. A nuclear test of a test of a nuclear weapon on a ballistic missile fired out over the East Sea, for example. China's fourth nuclear test was on a ballistic missile fired out over the Western deserts. So could happen. Clear sign of instability in North Korea would be something that would grab people's attention. You know, a major confrontation between the authorities and one of the markets or something like that. So there are a variety of things that could capture people's attention. North Korea could also shell an island. They've done it before, it could happen again. North Korea could also do a missile launch that was an oops. Didn't quite go where it was intended to and wound up on South Korean territory. They could have a rogue general do something. So there are lots of things that would clearly bring major attention to the North Korean problem. Hopefully we're prepared for that full range and more, but I don't know.
Well, Bruce, thank you very much. And ladies and gentlemen, and the meeting is adjourned. But I will make one announcement for next program. Next program is coming on October 19th, same time block. The speaker will be Admiral Jonathan Greenard, former Chief of Naval Operations. So stay tuned. You will get the invitation. Thank you, Bruce. This is great. We'll stay in touch. Take care. Bye.
Bye. Thank you all.
All right.
Thank you.